At first glance, Bryan seemed like a regular student, with an unusual interest. He was 26, living in Pennsylvania, and completely immersed in the world of criminology. But it wasn't just some casual fascination with true crime documentaries or podcasts. No, Bryan was consumed. He was studying for his master's degree in criminal justice, and his days were filled with lectures about crime scenes, forensics, and the psychology of killers. But somewhere along the way, something in him changed. One assignment in particular stands out. In 2020, Bryan was given a task in class: write a research paper on how to process a real-life crime scene. Simple enough, right? But Bryan's response was anything but typical. He turned in a 12-page paper that read more like a horror novel than a research essay. In it, he described a fictional murder of a woman in a trailer park stabbed to death with a knife. But what caught his professor's attention wasn't the brutality, was the disturbing precision. Bryan didn't just describe the crime. He went into chilling detail about the kind of gear investigators would need to wear to avoid leaving behind DNA, how to move through the scene without being detected, how to avoid making mistakes. It was as if he wasn't just imagining how to solve a crime. He was imagining how to get away with one. To anyone else, it might have been just an over-the-top academic exercise. But to Bryan, this seemed to be something more like a blueprint, something he'd been thinking about for a long time. And it was only the beginning. For most people, graduating with a master's degree would be enough. But not for Bryan. His obsession with crime wasn't something he could just walk away from. In fact, he wanted more and more research, more knowledge, more immersion in the darkest parts of human behavior. So he made a decision that would change everything. He applied to a PhD program in criminology across the country. He left Pennsylvania behind and moved to Pullman, Washington, a quiet college town tucked in the Pacific Northwest. There, he enrolled in a doctoral program that would allow him to keep diving deeper into the minds of criminals. It sounded impressive on paper. But behind the scenes, Bryan wasn't just studying crime anymore. He was thinking about it constantly. By now, the line between academic curiosity and personal obsession had completely blurred. He wasn't just learning how investigators solve murders. He was absorbing every detail of how they work, how they fail, what mistakes they make. He wanted to be the smartest person in the room. And maybe, just maybe, the one who could outsmart everyone. And while Washington offered him a new campus and new opportunities, it didn't come with one important thing: vegan food. Bryan was a strict vegan, and his options in Pullman were limited. So he started crossing state lines literally to get his meals 15 minutes away in the nearby town of Moscow, Idaho. There was a small, vegan-friendly restaurant that quickly became his go-to spot. But it wasn't just the food that kept bringing Bryan back, because that's where he first saw her. Her name was Madison. She was 21 years old, a student at the University of Idaho, and she worked at the vegan restaurant Bryan had started frequenting. By all accounts, Madison had no idea who he was. There's no evidence they ever spoke, no messages, no phone calls. But something about her caught Bryan's attention, and he couldn't let it go. At first it was subtle. A social media account tied to Bryan began liking Madison's posts consistently. Then things escalated. Cell phone records later showed Bryan's phone pinging cell towers in Madison's neighborhood over and over again. He didn't live anywhere near her, but somehow, he kept ending up in the same area. Surveillance cameras caught his white Hyundai circling her street on multiple occasions. And this didn't happen once or twice. It went on for months. Now think about that. Months of driving out of state, lurking in her neighborhood, showing up in the background always, just far enough away not to be noticed. It wasn't just a passing interest anymore. It was stalking. Silent, calculated, unseen. But Bryan wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. He studied routines. He watched from a distance. And all the while, Madison had no idea she was being followed by someone who had spent years studying how to commit the perfect crime. And then, after months of circling her life from the shadows, he made his move. It was just another Saturday night in Moscow, Idaho. Madison was home. In the 3-story house she shared with her roommates, other college students, just like her. They had laughed, gone out, maybe stayed up a little late. But by 4 a.m., the lights were out. Everyone was asleep. The house was quiet. That's when Bryan made his move. He dressed head to toe in black, gloves, mask, hoodie. He grabbed the knife he'd chosen for this moment. One he had no intention of leaving behind, and slid behind the wheel of his white Hyundai. He drove the familiar 15-minute route into town, parking just behind Madison's house. Then he crept through the shadows, slipped through the sliding glass door at the back, and entered. Inside, the house was still. On the 3rd floor, Madison and her roommate were asleep in bed side by side. Bryan made his way upstairs, moving silently, confidently, like someone who had rehearsed this 1,000 times in his mind. Then, he struck. Without warning, he lunged forward, stabbing one of the women repeatedly as she slept. The other woke up, confused, terrified, but it was too late. Bryan turned on her next. In seconds, both women were gone, but he wasn't finished. On the floor below, another roommate had just received a late-night DoorDash order. She might have heard something, maybe footsteps, maybe a cry, but before she could react, Bryan found her too. He attacked her and then her boyfriend, who had been asleep in the same room. It was sudden, brutal, and over in moments. For young lives, wiped out in a calculated rampage. As Bryan made his way out, there was a moment, one detail that would matter later. One final roommate saw him. She spotted a figure in black, wearing a ski mask, silently slipping through the house. He didn't hurt her. For whatever reason, he walked right past her and vanished into the night. He had done it, or so he thought. When the sun came up over Moscow that morning, no one had any idea what had happened inside that house. For college students gone, no warning, no signs, no struggle heard by neighbors. It was as if a ghost had slipped in and out, leaving death in its wake. And for a while, that's exactly what Bryan was, an invisible monster. He returned to his life in Washington like nothing happened. He drove back across state lines in his white Hyundai, parked it, and blended right back into the world of lectures and research. Just another PhD student. And from the outside, there was no connection. He didn't know the victims personally. He lived in a different town, a different state. There was no clear motive, no direct link. Police were left with chaos and no answers. But they had one clue. A tan leather knife sheath left at the scene. It was found lying near one of the victims. It looked like it had fallen during the struggle, maybe pulled off during one of the attacks. And while it didn't have a name on it, it did have something even more valuable. It was male. But when police ran it through their database, it didn't match anyone. Whoever left it behind had no criminal record. So for now, the killer remained nameless, faceless, and still out there. Meanwhile, Bryan was taking no chances. He started cleaning everything. His car, his apartment, his office. Scrubbing surfaces, removing anything that could be traced. He even changed his car registration, making it harder to identify him as the driver of that white Hyundai seen near the crime scene. In his mind, he was still playing the game. Still believing he was smarter than the police. Smarter than everyone. And for a while, it looked like he might be right. Let me know when you're ready for Section 6, the crime scene and his mistake, or if you want me to tweak anything. For weeks, police were stuck. They had 4 victims, a brutal scene, and a mountain of fear spreading across the college town, but barely any leads. The killer had worn gloves. He'd come and gone quickly. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no camera footage catching a clear face. Just the lingering shadow of that white Hyundai, and one critical mistake. The tan leather knife sheath. It seemed like Bryan had thought of everything except that. In the chaos of the attack, the sheath must have slipped from his clothing, maybe dislodged in the frenzy. And inside that sheath, investigators found something that would change everything. A single trace of male DNA. The problem? That DNA didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases. No arrests. No prior offenses. It was a ghost's fingerprint. But science had another tool for DNA tracing, while Bryan was busy covering his tracks. scrubbing his car and quietly fading back into the background. Police were getting creative. They began looking for the white Hyundai spotted near the house, cross-referencing ownership records, analyzing traffic footage, reviewing campus parking data. Eventually, they found a match. A white Hyundai Elantra, registered to a man named Bryan, PhD student, criminology expert, living just across the border. And now, they had a real suspect. But suspicions weren't enough to make an arrest. They still didn't have direct evidence tying him to the crime, until they got a wild idea. What if they didn't need Bryan's DNA, directly just his family's? And that's when they went to the trash. It was a long shot. But at this point, investigators had nothing to lose. They knew who Bryan was. They knew he drove the right car. They knew he studied crime in obsessive detail. And now, they had DNA, as not enough to name him outright. So, they turned to the one thing he didn't expect: his trash. In December, investigators worked with the FBI and the local sanitation department. They quietly went to Bryan's family home where he had been staying for the holidays and collected garbage from the curb. Simple household trash. Nothing that would raise suspicion. But they weren't looking for receipts or notebooks. They were looking for DNA. And then, buried in the garbage, they found it, a used Q-tip. It didn't belong to Bryan, but it belonged to his father. And when forensic scientists compared that DNA to the sample found on the knife sheath, they made a chilling discovery. It was a familial match. The odds were overwhelming that the DNA from the crime scene belonged to the biological son of the man who had used that Q-tip. In other words, it was Bryan. That was the final piece. The puzzle snapped into place. Within days, law enforcement moved in. Bryan was arrested and taken into custody. The criminology PhD student who had written essays about perfect crime scenes had become the center of one. Bryan's arrest sent shockwaves through the college towns and beyond. A man who had spent years studying murder, crime scenes, and forensic science had suddenly become the subject of his own horrifying case. It was almost too chilling to believe. He pleaded guilty not to avoid justice, but to avoid the death penalty. That much we know. But beyond that, the story gets quiet. There was no trial, no dramatic courtroom battle to uncover the why or how. Bryan chose to keep his reasons locked away. Why did he pick those 4 victims? Was it simply obsession? A twisted test of his own knowledge? Or something darker still? We may never know. The haunting part is this: a brilliant mind turned deadly, all because fascination with crime crossed the line into something far more sinister. And it leaves us wondering how many others are out there, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, secretly planning the unthinkable.